Welcome to the Harvard Business Review IdeaCast. I'm Sarah Green. I'm here today with Harvard Business School professor David Garvin, author of Rethinking the MBA, Business Education at a Crossroads. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, Sarah.
So I'd like to start by asking you why a business school professor might see a need for a book on rethinking the MBA.
Well, it all started with Harvard's centennial. 2008, HBS celebrated its 100th anniversary. We had a number of colloquia or workshops. One of them was about the future of business education. My colleagues asked if I would be the one to lead that process, and that's what got us started.
Okay. How did you decide to really delve into the research? And when you were doing the research, did you find that other business schools were defensive at all about you questioning maybe their purpose?
Actually, quite the opposite. Once we got started, the first thing we heard from other business schools was, "Thank goodness you folks are doing this. We all need to take a close look at business education." The research moved in several waves. Wave one was we did interviews. We talked to about 30 to 40 deans from business schools around the country and also in Europe, a few in Asia as well as 30 to 40 business executives from a wide range of different sectors. Then we looked closely at different curricula and various innovations in business education, new courses, new approaches to teaching. And finally, we did case studies, 6 in all, on different business schools, each of which was doing something special. Stanford was customizing its curriculum, Yale was integrating its courses, and so on.
Have you talked with students at all about any of this research?
Well, we talked to students in 2 ways. First, I was for many years chair of the elective curriculum at HBS, which means I was in charge of the second year. So for every single year that I held that post, I would hold 3 to 4 focus groups with students each year. Groups of 6 some odd students just to talk with them and find out what they liked and what they didn't like about the business education. When we did the case studies on each of the different schools, we ran similar focus groups at every institution. 6 to 10 students, often multiple groups, to get their sense of what they were finding.
How do you think the future MBA will be different than the MBA is maybe in the past? It sounds like what you're saying is that something about what we're doing now isn't working. So what do you think the future MBA will need to do to sort of address that?
Well, let me put it in a larger context. We talk in the book about the trilogy, the 3 things that every professional school, every professional education should provide: knowing or knowledge, doing or skills, and being or a sense of purpose and identity. For many years, ever since the classic reports by Carnegie and Ford in 1959, business schools have focused on knowing. They've been highly analytical. They taught economics, they taught statistics, they taught finance, they taught accounting. Much less emphasis on skills or being and a sense of purpose. We see business schools balancing the scales. In the future, there'll be equal weight not only on knowing, still important, absolutely vital, but also on skills. How do you run a performance review? How do you run a team meeting? And also on a sense of being or purpose. What's the role and responsibilities of a business leader today?
And now, is some of that to address the pretty frequent criticisms you hear about MBAs that they don't actually know how to manage, and that in fact a business education can't really teach people how to manage because you have to learn by doing it?
Well, let's divide the question into 2 parts. First, what's missing? And second, could a business education actually deliver it? In terms of what's missing, it's very true. The criticism of MBAs has for many years been they know a lot, but they don't know how to put it into practice. Many of our interviewers said MBAs are a little weak when it comes to understanding organizational realities, power, politics, hidden agendas, coalitions, the realities of implementation. How do you get things done? Now, clearly that's a criticism that's valid and which needs to be addressed. We do believe you can address it within business schools. And much of what we talk about is the need for more applied work. Not only more coursework, but more field work, where people actually get into companies, get into organizations, do supervised projects, and then reflect on their experiences and learn from them.
Do you find maybe something that would help with that is admitting students who were slightly older and had slightly more work experience? Do you find that true in the students you work with?
It's less a function of age than it is a function of experience. Students need some exposure to the real world of business practice. But once you get to 1 or 2 years, they seem to know enough. 3, 4, 5, 6, or even 10 years of experience doesn't add all that much. The big difference is between a newly minted undergraduate and an undergraduate who has 2 or 3 years of business exposure.
Now, I'd like to ask you, my understanding is that you started this research actually before the financial crisis. But during and immediately after that crisis, MBA started getting a lot of flack. Did you find that your research changed as a result of that, or was that surprising to you? How did that affect the final book?
Well, it was both good news and bad news. The bad news was that we did so much of our research prior to the crisis that we had to go back and re-interview a number of executives, many of the deans, and update all of our case studies. The good news was that it reinforced many of our earlier conclusions. But deans and executives added 2 more factors to the list of needs or the list of opportunities. First was pretty obvious. We need to expose students more to the roles and responsibilities of business and business leaders. The second was a little more subtle. We call it understanding risk, restraint, and regulation, or the limits of models and markets. The fact is people were pursuing unbridled acceptance of market capitalism. They didn't understand systemic risk. They didn't understand how individual actors, perhaps acting in their own best interest, could collectively cause disaster. Didn't realize that some of the assumptions built into models were not working. And that was a very big theme we heard in our re-interviews with deans and executives. Need to add this to the curriculum as well.
Now, did you hear anything, or do you have any thoughts on some of the MBA oaths that we've been hearing about in the news? Does the idea that there needs to be a sort of Hippocratic oath for management come into play?
Well, it was one of my students who actually started the process of developing the oath. And I remember having conversations with him very early in the process. I think it's an excellent idea. The most important thing to recognize, though, is it's not sufficient in and of itself, I don't think, to change behavior. An oath is a public commitment. And in that sense, people are more likely to stay committed to the values that they own up to publicly in front of others. But it needs to be supported by curriculum change, by more discussion of what exactly are the multiple stakeholders, not just shareholders, but society at large, employees, customers. How is it that we can expand the sense of business responsibility? Where does public responsibility end and private responsibility begin? With those added to the curriculum, an oath carries much more weight.
I'd like to ask you also about, you mentioned in the book the possibility that business schools might take a further page from doctors and mimic some of the practices of medical schools. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, one of the things that came up repeatedly was this need for field work, for actually getting students into the field in supervised projects. The challenge with those kinds of projects is that they're expensive because they use small groups. Instead of having a classroom of 80 or 90 students, you have a group of 6 or 8 students. And the question is, how do you get the faculty? Well, we thought for a while, we said, is there a model elsewhere that business schools could build on? The answer was yes, it's medical schools. So take as an example Harvard Medical School. Every entering class at Harvard Medical School, 4 years, 150 students each. So there are 600 students in total. The Harvard Medical School faculty numbers 10,000. Now, that has an easy explanation. It includes all of the doctors in the 17 affiliated hospitals who run clerkships, lead tutorials, in general run small group sessions for medical students. Same model could be applied to business. Instead of hospitals, it would be affiliated companies, or it would be alumni. HBS alone has thousands of alumni around the world. We could mobilize them to help, under faculty supervision, lead projects in the field.
Some of these changes sound pretty radical. What is going to be the sort of primary obstacle to overcome to actually drive some of these through?
Well, the changes are in fact radical, but there are 2 forces that suggest that the changes will in fact take hold. The first is that most of these changes are no longer pie in the sky. There is some institution out there already doing them. That's what took us so long. It was not only to come up with identified needs, but it was to come up with examples of institutions that are already fulfilling those needs. So the primary barrier, which is it can't be done, that's almost been removed already, because we have examples from countless institutions where these practices have already been put in place. The second barrier is the status quo. It's hard to change without pressure for change. That pressure is going to come from multiple fronts: alums, students themselves, university presidents, progressive faculty and deans. But already you can see the mounting pressure for change.
David Garvin, thanks for talking with us today.
It was a pleasure.
That's Harvard Business School's David Garvin, and the book is Rethinking the MBA. For more, go to hbr.org.